All right, so the last thing we're going to do here, not the last, but one of the last, is apply a Lumetri color effect to an adjustment layer above the A roll, move all the B roll clips up, and then use Lumetri scopes to perform a basic color correction. So I'm going to jump into my timeline here, hit the backslash key to zoom all the way out, and I'm going to select every clip that is on video 2, 3, or 4, anything that's above that, basically everything above the A roll. Now the option up and down arrow keys will move selected clips up or down a track without worrying about moving them earlier or later. So option up to move those up one layer. And then I'm going to go add a new item, new adjustment layer, and I'm going to hit OK. And let's go ahead and rename this so that we can know what it is. And I'm going to call this A roll C color correction A roll. Awesome. Now I can take that, drag and drop it in, and then simply stretch it or trim it out until it covers the whole track. Now remember, an adjustment layer, like we talked about earlier, is just like a transparent painted glass over the top that we can now go and add color correction to. So we've moved all our clips up, we added the adjustment layer, and now we'll use Lumetri scopes to do basic color correction for a balanced exposure, color, and saturation. So I'm going to find a video clip where I can see her nice and clear, and I'm going to go through and quickly just hide, turning off the little eyeball here on these tracks so I can see the effect on the entire A-roll track anywhere I scroll through. Now I'm going to go ahead and apply the Lumetri color effect, so I can go to my window menu, and I can open Lumetri color, and that will open up the Lumetri color values over here, but I also need window Lumetri scopes, which are going to show us our image in a new way that we've never looked at before. So if you right click on this, you'll see the options for a vector scope, for a histogram, for an RGB parade. You can turn all these things on. In my case, I'm going to turn off the histogram, and I only want my vector scope, my parade, and my waveform RGB. I'm going to go down to my waveform type, and I'm going to set that to luminance. So my waveform is going to give me just the brightness values from the left side of the screen to the right side of the screen, and then we'll look at each one of these in turn. So right now I'm going to right click and turn off the vector scope and turn off the RGB parade for a second, just for simplicity. So you can right click to turn those off, and here's what we're seeing. What we see right now is from left to right, how dark the pixels are. So if we were to take every pixel in this very first row or column and rank them in brightness from 0 being broadcast black, in other words, the darkest black that can go out over broadcast, or 100, which is the brightest white that could go out over broadcast, you'll see that we could actually get higher or lower. So if we had a high dynamic range television, or we're working in a high dynamic range, we could actually make even darker blacks and even brighter whites. But for now, we can see that on the left side, we've got a few pixels that are pure black. And you notice that they're not vertically arrayed. It's not like it can't really show you that there's black up here in the corner, but we can see that there's some that are already pure black. As we move across, we can see there's some spots that are pure white. You can see this one right here lines up with this pure white spot in the screen, and even maybe a few others over on the side, but everything else is somewhere here in the middle. So let's just go through and start to look at our color correction. The first thing we want to do is we want to balance out the exposure, the contrast, basically all the brightness values are not too bright or too dark. So if I were to just hit auto, you see that it's actually changed it quite a bit. If I reset, you can see that she's got a little bit of an orange tone to her skin. We used a warmer looking light, but auto, when I hit auto, you see that it raised these levels up just a little bit, but it also changed the color. So I'm going to reset and let's go through this piece by piece. First off, let's understand what each of these values do. So for the light, if I grab this exposure and I pushed it to the right, you notice every pixel gets brighter, right? So some obviously way too bright. So the exposure brings all the pixels brighter until she looks like she's burning up, or bringing it down brings all the pixels lower. So if we opened this image up, for example, and it looked like this, we could look at our scope and know, wow, these are not bright enough. If we were to open it up and it looked a little bit too much like this, we'd say, wow, there's a lot of pixels that are really bright here, and we'd want to bring that overall exposure down. I'm just going to reset this real quick and show you the others. Contrast is going to push the bright pixels brighter and the dark pixels darker, so if I grab this and turn it up, notice the bright pixels get brighter, the dark pixels get darker, and we get this very hyped image with very bright spots and very dark spots. If we take it the other way, all the pixels move towards the center. So the darker pixels get brighter, the brighter pixels get darker, and we get a much flatter image. Double click, and that restores us to where it was. Highlights tries to bring up mostly just the bright parts. or bring down mostly just the brightest highlights. Double click to reset. Shadows brings up mostly just the darker parts. You see them all moving up, or brings down mostly just the darker parts. And whites are going to ideally move up essentially just the whites or just the blacks. So you can see just the blacks being affected and the brighter parts being less affected. So I'm going to reset all of that. Let's just do a quick reset. So the first thing is we want to make sure we've got a nice even range here. The human face, her skin in particular, I'll give you a little color correction cheat sheet, color correction steps. And if I was to open this up, which we'll be looking at, then you'll see there's a few things in here. For example, skin tones should be 50 to 75% brightness on the waveform monitor and 40% saturated, etc. So here we are looking at our waveform, and we're seeing that female skin tone should be between 50 and 75%. So when we move left to right, we can see her head is right here, and we can see that most of her pixels, as she moves and talks, if I drag this around, you can see her head moving here. So her face is here just above 50, about 55%, and it goes up to around 75%. There's a little bit of pixels above that, up here above about 85. So we could try to adjust that, but really it seems like the brightness wise, she's in the right place. Now, do we have any spots that need brought down? Well, it looks like we've got some highlights right here that are clipping, and we can see that we're clipping those. So we could try to bring these highlights down just a little bit, or in this case, maybe even just the whites, just the brightest pixels. When I bring that down, you see that those are no longer clipping at 100%. Now the blacks are also clipping, so we could take the blacks and try to bring them up just a hair, and that's going to get them off of that absolute black line, which then evens it out just a little bit. So now we don't have any blacks getting crushed, in other words, losing all their detail, and we've recovered a little bit of the highlights. So now that's just a very simple adjustment that we could make. We could see what the auto does. If you hit auto, you'll see that it actually brought the whites up just a little bit. I'm not sure that I would do that, but it brought the blacks down and actually crushed those blacks. Not so you see the auto might do an okay job, but also it's not necessarily what I want. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to bring those whites down just a little so I'm not clipping the whites, and I'm going to bring up, let's try bringing up the shadows, which will bring up all the darks just a little, and maybe just bring up those blacks just a hair so they're not sitting there crushed at the bottom. So now we've got a much flatter image. And as you notice, if we move through here, now we've got a nice even image. Her face might be just a little bit bright. So we could bring the overall exposure down just a little bit and try to get her face sitting there between that 50 and 75. And that looks pretty good. So that is our first trick, is to go through and balance using those controls to get our brights and darks to where the blacks are not too black and being crushed, the whites are not too white and being blown out, and that the skin tones are sitting in a brightness level that you can find referencing on those color correction steps. So I've got some little notes here for accepted levels, males, and then different skin tones depending on one's ethnicity or background. So you can kind of see what some of these different percentages should be on the waveform monitor depending on skin color. Awesome. So now we've gone through and we've corrected our luminance, our dark and light, and we've made those flesh tones to be this kind of 65 to 75%, depending on who you're working with. Now we want to balance our color channels. So in order to do this, I'm going to right click on this and let's turn off the waveform and turn on the RGB parade. Right click, turn off waveform, and make sure my parade is set to RGB. Now here you're actually seeing the exact same thing. If we made this wider, you would see that you're seeing the waveform from left to right, but it's just squeezed all of them in. So now this whole wide angle is showing you, here's how much blue there is. There's a lot of bright blues and certainly some bright reds here, and we can see that probably from these pinks. But you notice that the balance is not exactly balanced. There's a lot more energy in the reds here on her, because of this doors has a lot more reds, these pinks, there's less of the greens and less of the blues. So let's just look at what we've got with that. Number one, if you grab this temperature and tint, that's going to let us balance out the colors on all of this. If I had anything in here that would be pure white, that'd be really helpful. But I'm going to take this temperature and just watch what happens. As I move it left to right, you'll notice it changes the balance of the blue energy and how bright those pixels are versus the red energy. But it pretty much left that green alone. So dragging to the right or to the left gives us a greater intensity in the blues and lower in the reds. If I drag it the other way, you see the blues go down and the reds come up, and of course everything gets very red and not very cold. Double click to reset. So in this case, I'm going to try to just grab this and balance it out a hair so that those blues and greens and reds get a little bit closer. I'm not necessarily trying to make it perfect because her face is not pure white. But notice, if I did balance this so that the red, her face here and the red and the greens and the blues was even, notice how close to pure white her face gets. So that's basically pure white would be an even balance of those three colors. So I'm going to get just close, but still leave a little bit of that natural skin tone in there. I like that. But do notice that if we grab this tint, if I grab that, that actually changes the amount of red and blue versus green. So we can get either by pushing up red and blue and pulling down green, we get a very magenta look, or the other way, we get a very green look. So in this case, since we already kind of dialed in her face with a balance of red and blue, and it looks good here, I'm going to just leave that green where it belongs. And of course, since I did this all to an adjustment layer, it did it to every single clip underneath. And so now they all look nice and balanced out. So we've balanced out our RGB using our RGB parade, and we'll use that again here in a minute on some other tracks. So I'm going to right click on this. My RGB parade looks good. And now I've adjusted my color. I've balanced my color channels, and I've adjusted my tone. And so now let's go ahead and check our saturation. Now you can see this says our brightness should be 50 to 75% for her skin. We already checked that, and about 40% saturated. So if I right click and I go over to the vector scope, and let's turn off the RGB parade, I can see a couple things. Number one, this shows me how much energy there is in these different colors. So I can see there's a good strong chunk of energy here in the reds, in the magentas, and in the blues. Because obviously she's got blue on, there's a lot of magenta colors, there's some reds, etc. So, but in this case, what I want to do is I want to be conscious of this hexagon here in the middle, because if there's more intensity, if it's outside that, it's outside what we call broadcast safe. And we can adjust our colors using our saturation. So if I grab this saturation, you notice if I push this up, all of those colors get even more intense. You see them move out towards that broadcast safe line, but they get really intense. If I take them the other way, you'll notice they get less and less, and they move back towards that center because they have less intensity in that color. So we actually eventually get a desaturated or no color in the image. So in this case, I really just need to bring down that magenta channel a little bit. So if I grab this, I could either pull this way until those magentas are back here. You can see I've got a pretty flat image now.
Or study for exams so you get confident A's every time.
But at this point, I can tell that I'm no longer oversaturating those magentas. Now, I've lost a little bit of the color that I love, and we could go into some more advanced tools for this. Maybe I'll just push it out just a little bit more, knowing that these magentas are probably going to be
I know how you feel.
Pretty intense, but that looks like a normal person under normal lighting, and her skin no longer looks orange. Now, if I want to see the difference, come up here and I can turn off basic correction, see what she looked like before, and now we've got a much more natural look. So now one last thing we want to do, we want to make sure that her skin tone actually aligns on this line right here. So I'm going to go and just real quick switch back over to my effect controls. I'm going to go to my Lumetri color plugin, and I'm going to create a little ellipse mask. And when I do that, actually, I don't want to do that on my Lumetri color plugin. I come in here and do that here on my opacity. And I'm going to make this little ellipse mask. I guess we could just use this. Let's use this ellipse mask, move it right here. And let's go through and just see what just this color is. So I'm going to mask out everything else here. Go back to my Lumetri scopes. And in this case, oh, I see what the problem is. I don't want to mask on. I was like, what am I doing here? I don't want to mask on my adjustment layer. I'm just going to pick a piece and go to her video track, click on one of the pieces of video, and I'm going to mask that. When I click on the opacity and add a mask, it lets me, grab that clip, select the mask, and let's put it up to where we're just seeing her face. And that, now when we go back to our scopes, we can see the colors in here, where do they line up? And you can see that they line up perfectly on that line. Now, if we had changed our temperature, if we had our temperature set very weird, then you see her skin tones no longer line up on that line. So if you're like, oh, I like this tint, well, that's fine, but her skin is not going to look normal. All human skin, black, white, any color, is all going to fall along this line. So I'm going to undo that, and we can see that with the color adjustments we've made, once we kind of cropped it out to where we're mostly only seeing her skin, it looks great. So I'm going to go back, open up the effect controls for this, and I'm going to delete that mask. I just opened up a mask on the actual video clip, not on the Lumetri color plugin, and that way we could just mask out her face and check our skin tones. So, and that actually seemed to work great. So now we have a
Know
very
how you feel? Because
clean
that's exactly where I
image, and it's looking good. All right, so now we have balanced that out. We've used Lumetri color and scopes. We've performed a basic color correction, and we've got a balanced exposure, color, and saturation. And then finally, it says we can turn on the vignette effect in Lumetri to tone down those pink lights. They're kind of distracting, but fortunately, if I select my color correction, I can come down to vignette. When I open up this vignette, I can add, by pulling to the right, I can add a white vignette. Or if I drag left, I can add a black vignette. So I'm just going to add just a little bit of a vignette here around the side. And then we can make the roundness adjust, maybe feather it a little bit more. I don't want it hard circle, but a little bit feathered. And that's going to tone down those lights just a little bit. Again, I can turn the whole thing off and on to see what it looked like. Here's where we started. And here's where we've ended up. Looking a lot more nice and natural. So that is our quick introduction to understanding and using our scopes, as well as how to apply a nice little vignette. I can turn my tracks back on and see how this looks.
should be studying less and living more. The problem is you don't understand.
Beautiful. Now we could go through and do this to several other tracks real quick. For example, if I come in here, I've got this read hundreds of pages. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to select this, go to this book, and I can see this book should in theory have white paper. But if I come over and I look at my waveform, I'll turn everything else off. The waveform, you notice there's no perfectly black parts. There's no perfectly white parts, but I could say, I'd like to brighten that up a little bit. So in this case, I could actually just brighten up the whole thing with this exposure and just make it to where that book is a bit brighter. So it's still not up here at 100%. There's no lights in here that would be 100%, but by bringing it up a bit, now we have a much brighter image on our book. Nice. We could also pull, since there is technically one black line in here, we could pull those shadows down just a little bit, make that dark line in the middle even darker, or pull those blacks down to where they're right above that 0, and that's even darker. But you notice, now that I've got my exposure balanced, I could go into my RGB parade, and in theory, this is white paper, but I can see there's way more red and blue than green. So again, I can use my temperature knob, and as I grab that temperature dial, that can adjust the balance of red and blue. So I'm going to get them kind of where these waveforms have more in common. They're more matched. And then I can see the green is still very low, but if we want it to be white, I can adjust the balance of red and green with blue, and watch what happens. As I bring those a little bit more into alignment, you can see that paper went from red to much more white. Now, if I want a little bit less green, maybe adjust that balance of red and blue. Now I'm getting a much whiter appearance on the paper. Don't want to go too far though. And there we've now balanced a very red looking book. It's a little too green for my taste. I'm going to pull those greens out just a little bit, make them down, and boom, now we've got
Hundreds.
a much less orange looking book. So in this case, I've grabbed this and
How to read hundreds
that's looking better.
of pages.
All right, so that is how we use those scopes and use them for basic color correction on both our main color correction with an adjustment layer, but even on these other tracks that we want to be able to balance and adjust. So for example, last one, let's come over here and look at this one. So here's an example that's in really bad shape. I'm going to select that clip and let's see what we can do to salvage it. So first, let's go and turn on our waveform. Turn off my RGB parade, and I can see there's a lot of really dark stuff and some really bright stuff. So not ideal. Let's see what auto does. If I hit auto, it makes the darks even darker and the brights even brighter. That's not what I want. Reset. So it'd be nice if I could bring these dark shadows up a bit, right? Because they're way down here at 0. So let's start with that. Let's try to pull the shadows up in brightness, and it helps a little bit, but there's still a lot of just pure blacks, and we might not be able to recover those. We could try pushing the whole exposure up because there's not really any detail in the sky that we seem to be missing. And pulling the exposure up helped, but I could also reduce the contrast because that's going to pull the dark pixels brighter and the bright pixels darker. So if I pull that contrast down, you can actually see we start to get some detail, but notice it gets a little grungy in here. So I don't want to do this too much. So let's see how that looks now.
Over 5,000.
And if we look without, there it is. They're still super dark, but with, we've brought the brights up a little bit, but we also brought the darks up. And so we can actually have some detail. Now, if we go and we look at our RGB parade, they look actually pretty balanced. So we can see kind of the overall whites are pretty balanced. But it'd be nice, let's go check out our vector scope to check out our saturation. And you can tell it's not a lot of saturation. So what we could do is try to push that saturation up. If we push it way up, then we at least see a little bit more detail in the colors. Maybe get a little blue back in that sky, a little magenta. We can actually get this little red. Let's turn this off and on. Much better clip, right? So just those same steps applied, and now it's looking pretty good. So that's how we're going to use our color corrector, and that makes a world of difference. And we've just got a much better looking clip where we can see the detail of people that are happy and excited, but we have used our Lumetri scopes to balance that out at least better than it was. All right, so that is our quick introduction to using the scopes and adding a vignette. And in the next video, we're going to look at rearranging this for social media, and we'll see you then.